kilometers of voters waiting in line for the first democratic elections in South Africa. And so when I voted for the first time last year in our national elections, it was both a very politically important moment for me, but also something that was deeply emotional and affirming. And I think that many people in Africa probably feel the same, given a history of people being denied the ability to participate in politics and their governance, whether it be through colonization or autocracy. And so what COVID does is put us in quite a difficult situation where we've seen a large number of measures being rolled out that could muzzle democracy, whether it's muzzling the press, whether it's presidents ruling by executive decree because of states of emergencies, but also very worryingly, the disruption of elections. And so to help us deal with the very difficult challenge of navigating public health and democracy, public participation, we have three really great panelists today who will speak in turn. Firstly, Mr. Moepya from the Electoral Commission of South Africa, Dr. Asante from Ghana Center for Democratic Development, and lastly, Mr. Suleman from Malawi. They will each speak for 15 minutes. And before I hand over, just a few rules of engagement to make today as productive as possible. I would ask that you all ensure that your mics are muted and that your videos are turned off unless you're speaking, just because we found that that's the best way to conduct these Zoom calls and preserve bandwidth. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box rather than interrupting. And once all of the speakers have spoken, they'll have a chance to engage with your questions, just in the interest of time. And lastly, this is being live streamed on Facebook, but it's also being recorded and will be posted on the center's website and social media. And so without any further ado, I hand over to Mr. Moepya from South Africa's Electoral Commission.
And it's good to be engaging with you on a subject that is very close to our hearts. Those of us who are elections practitioners are indeed engaged with the difficulty posed by COVID at this point. Let me kick off by saying, as we all know, COVID-19 is vicious and calls for the rich and poor, for the young and old, dictatorships and established democracies alike, to take precautions and find ways to live alongside a pandemic that currently has no cure. One that scientists do not fully comprehend yet, and one that has wreaked havoc in a fairly short space of time. The impact of this damage on livelihoods, on democracies, is going to last for a while. But some may say, in our country, we've just held elections. Hopefully by the time a cure is found, we would not be impacted. The truth is we all are impacted by this pandemic. While there is no known cure, no vaccine, we will need to find the best ways to coexist with the pandemic in the best ways possible, ways that are better described as non-pharmaceutical interventions, those of hand washing regularly, wearing masks, social distancing, and prohibitions on gatherings that we must uphold. Most of these measures are not friendly to methods we have hitherto used to conduct elections. A new normal seems inevitable, but what that is, we still don't know. There are a number of key questions we now need to engage as elections management bodies, as elections practitioners, and yourself as political scientists. One is that the COVID-19 pandemic has introduced concerns that have hitherto not been anticipated at a scale that we now face. The strident question we now face as electoral management bodies is whether to conduct elections at all, and at all costs, that is, or presumably we do this in defense of the timelines framed by our constitutions and our national legislations, which constitutions and national legislations, by the way, were not drawn with such, or a pandemic of such a scale in mind. We now need to consider this, look at our constitutions, our national legislations, and see what we need to do in the speed of the moment and deal with this matter. Alternatively, we need to find, to disrupt the electoral schemes that we've hitherto had, as we find progressive ways that enable us to hold elections. So we have on the one side elections that must take place. There are countries who, which have elections that they must conduct, but there are also, fears about the pandemic. And what this introduces in this game is not only affecting the freeness and fairness of elections, it is also affecting the quality of those elections and the participation of voters. When one looks at free and fair elections, I like a definition that is provided by Civic's Academy, and they say elections are free when, in a democracy, when all those that are entitled to vote have the right to be registered and to vote, and must be free to make those choices. It is important to note that the freeness of elections really is a function of those that are entitled to be participating in this franchise and have no hindrance to participating and making their free choice. On the other side, a free election is one where you are confident that who you vote for remains your secret. Fair in this context also means that all registered political parties have an equal right to contest the elections, to campaign for every vote, and to reach voters, to hold meetings and rallies with their offering. This gives them a fair chance to convince voters to vote for them. A fair election is one in which all voters have an equal opportunity, as Civic's Academy say. Now, I particularly chose this for a start because, one, we see that for elections to be free, everyone that needs to participate in that election must do so without hindrance. This is a question that we always have, and has been one that we progressively deal with. But fairness is one that has been significantly impacted by COVID-19. We have an environment where it is not possible for people to gather without the risk of this pandemic impacting on them. We have many countries that have closed the space where more than a certain number of people, the ballpark figure at the moment is 50, where no more than 50 people can meet. Elections that we have hitherto known are ones where stadiums were filled with supporters and political parties moving from one point to another, freely campaigning. That is no longer possible. We live in a continent, the African continent, where it's not possible to imagine that we will just activate a postal service and vote through the postal service. We equally do not have the telecommunications technology that will ensure that everyone is equal and can exercise their franchise freely. We do, in this instance, have a problem. To conduct an election in the COVID era and have or attain a fair election in the aftermath of that conduct of an election is proving to be a major challenge. The right to vote is one that has been fought for immensely by our people on the continent. There are many countries that continue to do so. And it is therefore a very sensitive matter that we now need to look at. If one looks at the number of challenges that have been before the courts concerning some of the elections that have had to be rerun, were indeed impacted by the fact that the right to vote was central and was in those instances considered not to have been completely discharged by electoral management bodies and or the agencies that are entrusted with this. And therefore, those elections have been rerun. In the COVID era, this risk is one that lies bare before us every day. We cannot also sit by and have electoral management bodies whose mandate is to conduct elections, sitting by and saying there's nothing we can do. And so we have to be devising ways and means to conduct elections. These are going to be very challenging. There are going to be debates. There will be persons that favor the postponement of elections under certain conditions. There will be others who say we'd rather risk the pandemic and not the elections. I'd like to pause there for an introductory remark.
Thank you so much. I think that's given us quite a good context and understanding of what exactly is at stake and the types of balancing of values that we're having to make here. And so I think the next speaker that I'm going to hand over, who can maybe give us a little more detail on what exactly has been happening in Ghana in terms of making these way-ups, is Dr. Asante.
Hello, and good morning to everybody. Really glad to be here. I think the fact that we have close to 100 people online across the continent engaging in this conversation means that we really are not in normal times. Often we probably will be flying to South Africa somewhere to have this kind of meeting. So this is really interesting times for everybody. I mean, from our side, I think it's interesting that the pandemic actually hit Africa on Valentine's Day. I think the first recorded case was in Egypt. And since then, all the 54 countries have actually recorded one case, at least, the recent, I think, being Lesotho. That kind of tells you how quickly this virus has transformed our lives and transformed our existence. Initially, there was a lot of fear for Africa because of poor emergency health systems and poor emergency infrastructure and so on. And, we didn't know how we were going to cope when people were falling critically ill, people were having, challenges around on the hospitals, what we were going to do. So far, it's not materialized. There's all kinds of reasons that have been put forward, including, whether we have a much younger population, whether or not we've been drinking not a lot of herbal tonics. That probably is preventing us from, getting sick. Even though there's a lot of worry about the circumstances for Africa, I think that what it presents to all of us, election management bodies, stakeholders, like civil society organizations, is that we have to react and adapt to living with a disease that is not going to go away anytime soon. You know, in Ghana, as at yesterday, our case count was 6,808 people infected with the disease, but we have about 2,700 recoveries, 32 deaths, which is quite low. But 14 out of our 16 regions have recorded infections, and this has happened very quickly in about a month. So it just tells you that anybody who has to run elections in this kind of contest have a huge task ahead. We know from data from the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, ISA, that there were about 22 countries that were facing one election or the other in 2020. A number of them have had to postpone those elections: Ethiopia, Cameroon, Chad, and so on. But we also know that a couple of them have gone ahead to organize polls in Guinea, in Mali, recently in Burundi. Unfortunately, some of those cases, I must say that these are not models that the rest of Africa should be following. Some of the underlying motivations are plain wrong, undemocratic, except maybe the case in Mali where there are extenuating circumstances. But you know, more care has to be taken. We have to accept that we're living with the virus, and therefore, until we get a vaccine, you know, we have to make sure that it is safe for people to go out there and exercise their franchise. Now, let me give you a bit more detail in the Ghana case, so that maybe it gives us some points of reference in terms of the questions that confront all of us as we try to adapt to this new situation. So before the outbreak in Ghana, we had the usual tussle between the two main political parties, the New Patriotic Party, which is the governing party, and the National Democratic Congress, which is the largest opposition, on whether or not we should compile a new register, voter register. The EC had argued that the system was obsolete. The machines basically were not fit for purpose. They wanted to introduce facial recognition to the list of you know, security features they needed for the register. So they needed to get rid of the current register and compile a new one. So the parties basically split in the middle. We've always had tussles over the voter register. We had it in 2012 when we first introduced biometric voter registration. So that was not new. Now, of course, once we had the COVID outbreak, all the plans that the EC had were also disrupted. You know, so the timetable for the calendar, electoral calendar, then immediately became compressed. But you need a register, whether even if it's you know, validated or you know, in a limited way, you still need a register before you could go ahead and add the other electoral processes. So currently, as we speak, the EC is planning to still compile a new register. The timelines for that register, in normal times, will take you about 2 months, 2 to 3 months. So if the EC goes ahead in June, for instance, then you're talking June, July, August, maybe September, before the register could be certified. Now, once you're able to do that, before you can actually take nominations for candidates, and that might happen in October, which means that you have only 1 month for campaigning in November, and then by December 7th, you have to actually conduct the elections for people to go and vote. Now, if you look at that kind of timeline, the implications are dire on many fronts. We have a little complication to this problem in that the EC also introduced a new an amendment to the current constitutional instrument that regulates the registration of voters, basically removing a previous ID card, electoral voter card, as evidence of identity or eligibility to register to vote. So basically, you have to have a passport or what they call a Ghana card, which is like a national ID card, and for you to be able to show your eligibility. Now, unfortunately, there are only 7 million people who have this Ghana card because the registration process is not concluded. And the option is that if you don't have the Ghana card, then you can get 2 registered voters to vouch for you. Now, you can imagine the chaos that will happen on registration day if people are trying to challenge who can vouch for who on that day. But the questions that come out of this are many. How do you keep people safe? So if they are going to compile a new register in the Ghana case, we are talking about registering close to 17 million people in a COVID context. How can you ensure social distancing? How can you ensure people remain disciplined? How do you protect frontline security staff and so on who are trying to maintain peace? Would the people turn out? If you can have all of these things set out, but hey, would individuals turn out to actually go and queue for hours so that they can register to vote? Is that choice fair? Are you putting onerous responsibility on their rights, or you are constraining their rights by forcing them to make this choice? And what are the real implications for that in terms of the legitimacy of the process? What about the shortening the campaign period? How do you ensure that people actually get an opportunity to interrogate what the parties are presenting so that they can make an informed choice? How do you promote issue-based electioneering in this kind of context? What about abuse of incumbency? A lot of countries have already shown that they want to gain a lot of political capital from showing that they are able to manage this crisis. And in an election year, that obviously means that the incumbent gets more airtime, almost completely dominate the airtime. It's able to move around and engage citizens while the opposition, doesn't get to move around a lot. It's happened in Burundi, some of the other places where elections have gone about. What about vote buying? Considering all the depression of incomes and the challenges with livelihoods that we're going to have, there are going to be a lot of desperate people who will be amenable to a few CDs here and there so that they can get a chance. So if you begin to think about all of these process issues, you have to ask yourself, what kind of credible outcomes can you get? How do you ensure that elections are peaceful, they are transparent, they are credible? So those are really, I think, the questions that confront us. And, you have to think about these things and find ways to mitigate the impact. And lastly, what if elections don't come on? What do you do? What are the options? So let me leave it there for now, and hope that we can engage some more.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. I think what was really interesting about that is that you've helped us see that this isn't a one-day issue. It's not how do we conduct the actual voting, but also an entire process of ensuring that campaigns can continue, of ensuring there's voter registration. But also something really important that maybe we can see some questions about later, is this idea of forcing people to choose between voting and their safety or health, and whether that amounts to a form of voter suppression. Are we excluding primarily old, sick people, people with underlying conditions from voting? And I know that was a major concern that arose during the United States Democratic primaries recently. So it'd be interesting to have more of a conversation about that later. But for now, Mr. Suleman, if you could just discuss with us the position in Malawi and any contributions that you may have in helping us understand that.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Good morning from Malawi. I'm Daud Suleman. I am part of the Malawi Congress Party. Right now, as I'm talking to you, I am about 400 miles out of the commercial city. We are on a campaign trail. So COVID-19 in Malawi here, we're on a full-blown campaign trail. It's a very unique situation that we're in Malawi. For a brief background, we had general elections last year on May 21, 2019, which where the outcomes were contested through a court battle that ran for about 9 months. So for 9 months, we've practically had the country on a standstill. And on February 3rd, 2020, there was a landmark decision by the Constitutional Court that annulled the result of the 2019 election. The case was contested by two major opposition leaders, Dr. Chakwera and Dr. Chilima, who took the current president, Professor Arthur Peter Mutharika, and the Electoral Commission to court to contest the outcomes of the election based on irregularities. So on February 3rd, the Constitutional Court declared the 2019 elections null and void and gave an ultimatum that gave a court order that in 150 days, we should have a new election and a new president installed. And midway through the 150-day space, that's when the COVID outbreak hit. From a global perspective, we do understand and appreciate the threat that COVID-19 has brought upon us. But on a local level, on a country level, as Malawi, there are a number of things that have made us to be in a very unique and peculiar situation. To begin with, we have a situation where the current government will do anything it can to protect its incumbency and in a way to delay the election or to even not have the election take place. This has been witnessed through a number of actions that have been taken by the current government. Actions such as the secrecy on the COVID-19. We don't know for a fact how many people actually have been tested, how many people have tested positive, and how many people have actually died. We are sitting on a death toll of 3, which have been contested by the general populace. So we have a government that has not been very forthcoming with information. We are in a situation. Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please continue.
Okay. So we are in a space where there is information blackout on what actually COVID-19 is and what are the threats. So as I am speaking to you, I don't know how I can turn this, but you can see where I am. They've come to attend to Harare at the expense or at the threat of COVID-19, because the people in the rural areas of Malawi don't have the right information. The people in the rural areas of Malawi are looking at COVID-19 versus their human right, versus their democratic right of them having a government that they trust in, a government that they can believe in, unlike what is happening at the moment. So we are running a situation in Malawi where the people of Malawi have chosen to put their democratic rights ahead of the public health crisis that we face. This, I personally put the blame squarely on the current regime because of the secrecy and because of the way that it has managed COVID-19. As far as we know, they have politicized COVID-19 in a way that has put the people of Malawi in a vacuum, in a black box, that they don't fully understand what is at stake. Now, the local person in Malawi has been forced to make a decision whether to follow COVID-19 regulations or to go to Harare and to support candidates. Now, what is happening here is not just the opposition political party taking to the streets. Even the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and its president, they are doing similar rallies at the expense of COVID-19. Now, the question that we have is there something that the government knows that we don't know about COVID-19 status in Malawi? Because if we talk about precaution, we haven't seen the state president take precaution. We haven't seen his ministers take precautions. What we have seen are full-blown rallies that the ruling party has undertaken on the streets of Malawi. And us as opposition players, and as people that fought in the court case, I for one was one of the witnesses for the opposition parties, and I went into that court process because I thought that our democratic principles and values were being eroded by a few people that were hell bent on destroying our democracy. Now here we are again. Here we are again. 150 days should end on July 2nd. By July 2nd, according to the Constitutional Court order, we should have an election, and the people of Malawi should have exercised their right, and they should have elected a president that should lead them. COVID-19 is here to stay. We don't dispute that fact. But what we have is a situation where a government is playing double standards, where a government is withholding information, where a government is playing hide and seek with democracy at the expense of COVID-19 and at the expense of their selfish ambitions. So here in Malawi, we have COVID-19, but we don't have the finer details of it. No one can put a number to how many cases do we have. Where are these people being tested? Where are these people that are sick? Where are they being quarantined? What we have is fabricated information. We have a minister of health who is the chairman of the COVID-19 response task force. In his home village, he's organizing football tournaments. Week in, week out, you have over 1,000 people that are going to a stadium to watch and to play football games that are being played under the auspices of the Minister of Health in Malawi. Now, do we suspend life in Malawi? Do we suspend democracy in Malawi? Should we suspend our human rights in Malawi at the expense of COVID, which we are not so sure? how much we've been hit in Malawi and where we stand as a country. So all of this, I put the blame on the government, because we are here under the government of Malawi, and we should be directed accordingly by the government of Malawi. I submit, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Suleman. I think you've touched on something that's important all around in terms of COVID-19, which is just the general lack of information and the spreading of false information that is being prevalent in so many countries, and how that especially makes it difficult to make these kind of really important decisions. So we've heard from all of our panelists at the moment, and we're going to proceed now to answer a few of the questions that you guys have all raised. Starting off, perhaps, I think, Mr. Moepya, I know South Africa is scheduled to engage in some local government elections in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And perhaps with that in mind, could you maybe answer the questions of Edwin and Dr. Olalua, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, who've asked you what you think the best bet is moving forward. What is the Electoral Commission considering as a strategy moving forward for those 2021 elections? And perhaps if I could just add, do you think that we need to start considering alternatives to conventional elections, things like mail-in ballots, electronic systems, which I know have been discussed in the context of the US? Mr. Moepya?
Oh yes, I didn't realize that I was muted. Thank you very much, Sohela. Let me try and answer the questions that have been put before me. Are you there? Hello?
Yes, we are.
Wonderful. I'm going to deal with the questions that have been put before me. This being from Menelik, I think from Ethiopia, saying, are we aware of the Ethiopian case? I think the Ethiopian case is very interesting, where an election that was intended to be held was requested to be postponed. In fact, not requested. I think the current incumbent simply decided that this election must be postponed, and I think it has given the impression that they have something to hide. That leads me to a question that someone, I think it's Edwin, asked me. Edwin says, but what should be done? I don't think that Africa even has a similar depth of the problem. We've just had the case of Malawi now, where people have chosen to rather face the pandemic than face a government that they think is not or should be voted in or voted out of power. Now, my view is that in the case of Ethiopia, what would seem evident and realistic would have been to engage political players. It does not guarantee that there will be an outcome, but it does put in a process where everyone interested in the process, who's a stakeholder, would have raised concerns they have or contributed a possible solution, and out of that informed a decision either to proceed or not to proceed. In our own instance in South Africa, Sohela, we have decided that local government, we will continue to plan for it. We have no opportunity to change the way that we vote. For example, there is not suddenly going to be some telephone or cell phone that is now a voting booth, and because the law has to be changed, People have to be socialized into it, and extensive consultations have to be undertaken in that respect. We simply would not have the time to do it, and the infrastructure to run with that. And so we would work in a context of a pandemic, if we do, and say, in order to deal with this, for example, could we, and I'm just giving an example, I'm not saying it's going to be so, we could say, could it be that instead of having an election that would last in one day, we should have an election that lasts over 5 days, and these voters come on day one, these voters on day two, these voters on day three, and so on and so forth. We would have to find creative ways to live with that pandemic. Someone asked me, where do I stand in respect of risking postponing an election and risking COVID? I think these are matters that jurisdictions have to deal with. And let me use the case of Malawi again. We've had Daud now talking about the choices people have made. It is not inconceivable, even in Malawi, a country I know very well, it's not inconceivable that that election may indeed proceed. But at the point when an outcome must be declared, somebody might run to court with good evidence and say, this election could not have been free or fair, could neither have been free nor fair, in that my support comes from this area, and that area is currently the epicenter of a pandemic. And the people that ordinarily would have come to vote for me haven't. And herewith affidavits from these people saying they've not been able to vote because they are confined, and there has not been anybody to come and take. So every jurisdiction has to look at what its arrangements are, how best they could handle this, whether they postpone or whether they proceed with measures in place. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all situation. The last thing that I thought we needed to deal with was the question of where we are as countries, even on the African continent, where we could all sit at home and vote. I don't know any single country on the continent that could hold such an election. I don't imagine that we would not be in a position to possibly experiment with that in 5 years to come. The problem is, what do we do with the current problems? I think, as we have done in South Africa, and I'm not saying it's a good example, we have simply approached the courts on elections that were due, local government elections, ward elections, in other words, constituency elections in local government, that we have postponed because at the time the pandemic hit us, we were just not in a position to conduct an election. We didn't have protective equipment and material. We did not understand this. We couldn't handle queues. The campaign cannot be handled. And so we are buying time to understand a little more and to see how best we can accommodate that situation. We approached the court, and the court has indeed favored us. We didn't just run to the court. We engaged political parties, electoral stakeholders, and we were all agreed, and then we went to court. And the court gave us room for us to consider the matter with elections postponed. That's really where we are. Thank you, Sohela.
Thank you very much. I think it is really important and unfortunate that we can't have a one-size-fits-all strategy that we decide on in this webinar. It is a case-by-case, very context-specific decision that needs to be made. But specifically then with regards to Ghana, Dr. Asante, I see we have a question from Dr. Olalua, who has asked for a little more clarity regarding the constitutional amendment. Specifically, how does the constitutional amendment in Ghana run in conformity with the terms of those presently in office?
Yeah, thank you. I think if I get it right, this is the situation where if we cannot have elections by December 7th, which is really the cutoff point for us. What happens? Our constitutional arrangement is a little bit unclear about that particular situation. So currently, as there's been a lot of discussion on this. As it stands now, the term of the president is fixed, and come midnight 6th of January 2021, that president would have to exit office. So there's really no room within the Constitution for you to extend the term of the president. Now, given that situation, there's been some discussion, some attempt to reinterpret the Constitution that may allow Parliament to be recalled, which is the Parliament that may have been dissolved, to be recalled with the Speaker as an acting president until new elections are conducted for a new president to be elected. So our situation is a little bit difficult. And I think that is probably the case in most presidential systems. I think the parliamentary systems have a little more flexibility when it comes to these matters. But when you are giving that kind of contest, then it means that you have to have elections if you are to avoid a constitutional crisis. Otherwise, then the Supreme Court has to step in and interpret the situation so that you could look at alternatives. So at the moment, I think everybody is minded to ensure that we can actually organize elections come December 7th, so that we don't have to look at the very complex alternative, which is the outcome is unknown. So that's the situation where we are in at the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. Another question that I think is really interesting, these are directed to Mr. Suleman, regard the role of the opposition parties in Malawi. So Melissa asks, as political leaders, what measures have you put in place to ensure the safety of those who are attending rallies or are your constituents? And we also have a question that asks, to what extent are the opposition then contributing to the spread of COVID by continuing to hold these rallies? And secondly, does the opposition have a position on whether the election should proceed or be postponed, given the reality of COVID, but also the fact that the Malawi's Electoral Commission is not ready or able to currently hold a free, fair, and credible election in the circumstances? Oh, I think that we might have lost Mr. Suleman. So perhaps if he returns a little later, we can direct those questions at him again. But for now, I think there's quite an interesting question, and either one of you, Dr. Asante or Mr. Moepya, can answer this. And he acknowledges the possibility of using COVID to postpone elections and stifle voting rights, and asks who should ideally be making decisions about postponing elections, whether it be the incumbent, the opposition, the church, courts. How do we ensure the greatest protection from the possible stifling of democracy?
Let me attempt to deal with the question broadly, and I'll try and have reference to Malawi and other jurisdictions. I think the Malawi situation, as we all know, it's a very difficult one. It takes into account a call made that the Electoral Commission had not done its best to ensure that that election was an election which was credible. Now, I'm not dealing with the merits. I'm just dealing with what the court has said. In that situation, we know that the Electoral Commission has opposed the setting aside of the election. If it were to be that Electoral Commission going to court to say that we are busy organizing an election whose outcome we don't believe will be free and fair, it could be seen, it runs the risk of being seen as in fact refusing to do that which the court had required of it to do. And if it were to be the incumbent president, I think the same would apply. But in this situation, you possibly have civil society organizations that would carry sway and say, in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, we are in fact organizing an election at the expense of the livelihoods of Malawians. It cannot be free, it cannot be fair. And approach a court with evidence, and I think that election may be postponed in the circumstances. But I'm not saying that is so. I'm just talking about under normal circumstances. That's really what we see. In South Africa, where I am and where I function, the Electoral Commission, where I am a member, one of the duties we have is not just to organize an election and tick a box that election has been held. In fact, the Constitutional Court has said that we have to ensure that the right to vote is not hollow. It's not because you've now decided next week, Wednesday, is going to be an election, let's go and have it. And it doesn't matter how well you have prepared and how careful you have, thoughts you have given to any other considerations. It says that right, you've got to do everything possible to make sure that that right is exercised for the purpose that will achieve the ends for which it was intended. It cannot be a tick box exercise. And I'm afraid in our country, if you were to do an election next week, there's a fair chance that a court would find that that election could not have been free, it couldn't have been fair, because it does not give effect to all of the considerations that are necessary to ensure that the election is indeed free and fair. Thanks, Sohela.
Thank you. Dr. Asante, did you want to add something to that question, or are you okay?
Just something short. I think, elections, from my experience, are both a legal process, but it's also a political process. So you always, electoral rules are very, very important because it does provide the guidelines, the agreed steps that should be taken in a case like this. But it also a political process because, stakeholders, whether it's the parties or the civil society, media, all have to be persuaded that there is fairness in the process. And so even as you look at your rules, your constitutional arrangements, you always have to go beyond that, particularly in the context which is constrained as we currently are in, to make sure that you can build consensus on even matters that you may have to undertake outside of the rules. So there's always a lot of talking to be done when you are confronted with these kinds of crises. And so that's for me is something that everybody must remember, that you have to be pragmatic, but to be doing that, you have to make sure that you create a platform for everybody to be able to contribute their ideas and forge ahead together.
Thank you. Theo has a question about Burundi, who I'm sure we all know, has gone ahead and conducted elections in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps one of you could offer your thoughts on that process. Do you think that that was the correct choice? Do you think that it was carried out in a reasonably fair way? Or do you see any concerns arising in the near future regarding those elections? I know that the majority party won with something like 71% of the total votes. So there is obviously a lot of room for contention in that context.
Yeah, maybe let me make a comment about Burundi. And I think in my opening remarks, I did say that Burundi is definitely not the model to follow. Even before COVID-19, Burundi, didn't organize free and fair elections. The regime was very oppressive. It suppresses, the opposition, and it got worse with the COVID, because once there was a shutdown and a process to sort of stop campaigns and so on, it means that the opposition really did not even have an opportunity to campaign. So the Burundi case, as I said, is definitely not one to follow. And actually, if you watch closely, there wasn't any effort to protect lives, in terms of creating the conditions for people to go and exercise their franchise responsibly. They were crowding from both opposition and government sides. There wasn't really as if the disease didn't exist. So, I mean, we don't know what the health implications that will come after this, because if there is community spread in Burundi, then you can imagine that one episode of electioneering could add, can create a really damaging impact for the country down the line. So we just hope that it doesn't. But that's the kind of risk that you take when you have to conduct elections with large numbers and you're trying to protect the electoral processes. You really create a risk as well, a health risk, and those things have to be managed very carefully.
So Hela, I think I agree with Kojo, and I also just want to make a somewhat controversial but real point. Last night, I watched on Al Jazeera some aerial photographs taken in Yemen, where we have been told that the pandemic has not been pervasive. But aerial photographs I saw last night on Al Jazeera showed grave sites that were way busier than normal. In fact, they interviewed someone who said, we are more than 10 times busy than the normal schedule. Now, the point I want to make is that in instances where you have repressive regimes and where information is not offered with sincerity, we will regrettably have elections being pushed to happen. And the consequences of what would happen afterwards, we will never get to see under normal circumstances. And I want to really say that it just appears reasonable that opposition parties, governing parties, must find accommodation and put livelihoods of the people that vote them into office first. It does seem to be a realistic thing to say we will only undertake an election when we have made the preparations that will have a semblance of safety being taken into consideration when that election is conducted. I just wanted to make that, and I think there are many countries. We have seen this in China. We have seen this in the UK, and I'm sure it exists for all of us, where the numbers that have been recorded have had to be adjusted by significant margins because the figures we are given are the minimum. It's a minimalist approach. I think the damage that this pandemic is causing is a little more than what we are made to believe.
Definitely a reminder that democracy does rely on the press, on information, in order to be truly meaningful, and something that we must all keep in mind during this time. So we have a little bit of a discussion in the comments about the use of electronic or alternative means of voting, and we have someone who says that whilst this is possibly a valuable alternative, there's serious repercussions in countries. I think they use the example of Zimbabwe, but I'm sure it's true for many African states, where large amounts of voters cannot easily connect to the internet, do not have ready access to electronic devices, especially in rural areas, especially in poorer areas. And so my question is, are those considerations that have been taken into account when considering the viability of alternative forms of elections, and that's why they've been discounted, or are they still on the cards, but only in the future since we don't have the capacity right now?
The unfortunate thing is that many of our countries have been experimenting. We have been making provisions in law to allow experiments to be undertaken in parallel with our traditional voting methods, because there is a time that is required to build confidence into the alternative. If you've never used postal voting, you can't just drop the one and start with the other. When you have a close to non-existing postal service, or the service quality of postal facilities, as an example, it's not good. Elections are significantly about trust as well, not just transparency, but trust too. And these are things you've got to demonstrate, and that's the challenge we all face. Governments face, political parties face, citizens face, and electoral management bodies face. So the right thing to do would be for electoral management bodies and electoral stakeholders, so to put processes in place that are verifiable, that you can run with them for a period of time, and then say, this alternative method of voting is in fact reliable, because we can test it by verifying it against what we have done always in the past. I'm afraid the pandemic came at a point when we were way too far from concluding those kind of things. We now need to expedite that process. The challenge is funding, infrastructure, and those resources are going to be very difficult in the aftermath of this pandemic, when all of our economies are destroyed. And we will need to prioritize those things that are major investments we have to make into the future of our jurisdictions or countries. And that is the unfortunate challenge we're going to face hereafter.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Just to start from Mr. Moepya's, very, very important, critical statement about trust in elections. I mean, that's the foundation of any kind of electoral process that produces credible outcomes. You have to remember that technology is a tool. So technology in an electoral process is basically to kind of facilitate basically an already agreed process of integrity in the system. So for countries that are in basically the cups of organized elections, first of all, you don't want to throw in a new technology where you have not had the opportunity to build the kind of trust processes around it, so that stakeholders would be willing to embrace it. But those who may have some time actually have an opportunity to consider, having hindsight of what has happened, that they might have an opportunity to begin to engage and maybe put the legislation in place to be able to get the agreement around it. But whatever we do with technology, it can only facilitate, as I said, the trust in the system that's already built. And hopefully, going forward, I think these are some of the things we have to consider. Actually, Ghana was considering voting abroad, processes to allow people abroad to vote in this election, but had to abandon that even before COVID, because getting the trust around that process was so complicated that it needed time. So those are the things that have to be considered when we think about technology. We would rather have a slow system that allows us to have peaceful transitions in power and continuity in government, than a fast system that creates, chaos and violence.
Definitely. And I think both of you have touched on one of the possible aftermaths of continuing with elections being a loss of trust in the general electoral process and in democracy if we look to alternative measures. But we also have a question here about just in general conventional elections. Should we continue? The possible aftermath is that we have especially the opposition or the losing party challenging those decisions, going to court, and how does that then affect public trust in the system as a whole? But additionally, just from my side, assuming we can pull this off perfectly, another possible aftermath is that we have a change of government, especially in things like local government elections where there isn't maybe a set majority. How does that then affect us in dealing with this pandemic when we suddenly have a fresh new party, fresh new people in power who haven't been on the ground dealing with the rollout of solutions to this pandemic? Is it even feasible to consider changing our government structures during this time, or should we perhaps prefer a little bit of stability as we weather this storm and then deal with elections after that?
Sohela, I don't know if I understand that absolutely, but as I understand, those of us who are, on the coalface of elections management, I know we say this often, but sometimes people don't believe it. And I've seen it for, in more than 20 years of doing this. The job we have as election management bodies is to facilitate the will of the people. No less, no more. is to stand on neutral ground and say, this is the outcome of an election we verily believe was well conducted, and we are open to scrutiny about. And if the will of the people is that there must be a change of government, so be it. We, as an electoral management body, must be in a position to defend those that have won, because we are the ones that make that announcement and say they have won. We have to be able to say, why do we say so, and provide the evidence. But we also have the duty, which is much greater, to ensure that those that lose with credibility, that they are not, left with too many unanswered questions. We have to have a heart to engage with them, to show them, inside the operations that we conduct, that there has been nothing untoward taking away from them. In that instance, those who lose are placed in a better position to lose with dignity and to congratulate the winners. I fear that COVID-19 really brings forward a real risk. Last week, the Washington Post was running with an article that began to raise frightening things about the US and about the possibility of even the current president not accepting an election outcome when an election is run. In countries where people congratulate, candidates congratulate one another even before a formal election result is issued, to now begin to imagine that an outcome could be contested, a formal one, it's a frightening thing. And I'm not saying that article was right, but I'm saying it is beginning to give us an indication and an understanding that the challenges we face are severe, deep, and need our undivided attention if we are to deal with them in ways that will build confidence into the process as opposed to taking out confidence. Thank you.
I mean, there are two ways in which, in terms of judging the aftermath. I think in Ghana, when we had in 2012, that the election outcome was disputed by the opposition party. For 8 months, that particular case was litigated live on television for almost 8 months. And for that period, government business, was basically non-existent. The country just held its breath, waiting to know what the outcome of that election was. In the aftermath, when the Afrobarometer survey was conducted, the trust in the EC was at all-time low because the court processes exposed, some of the weaknesses of the EC. That was quite shocking. And it took a lot of time and the new EC to work hard to build this reputation up towards the 2016 election. Is to say two things that are fundamental to the aftermath process: the courts and public education and trust. So the courts are critical, and what kind of systems that they put in place. Rapid systems to adjudicate matters in a very transparent way that allows everybody to participate and see what's going on is important for how you resolve these kinds of conflict. The posture of the courts, the posture of candidates all become very, very important. And then when you have managed that, the public education that has to accompany that, to explain to the public what exactly is being discussed. Because remember, legal language can be very, very technical. And a lot of people have are hearing all kinds of stories, all kinds of rumors as to what had transpired. So you need a lot of public education, a lot of engagement, particularly from civil society. Even media, have to be properly conscientized to understand the legal language so that they can also mediate the process. So even as we think about COVID-19 and its current challenges, it is going to be around for a while. And in a post-COVID period, where a lot of people are suffering because of livelihoods, because of uncertainties, you need a leadership, an atmosphere which is understanding, accommodating. And it is not going to happen by chance. Leadership in every society has to anticipate, plan, be deliberate in engaging so that people begin to have more understanding and to be able to cope with the challenges that come about. So it's a lot of work, to plan for this current future that is upon us. And that's where I would really encourage, party leaders and civil society and media, to step up and, take responsibility. Because if we don't do it together, we will not be able to overcome this crisis. And I think we all have to take responsibility to make sure that we are able to just leapfrog this problem that is confronting us.
Thank you both so much. I think that at this point we can draw to a close. You've all given us a lot to think about, as have all the questions. I think some key takeaways are just that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem. We must be aware of our context, but we must do our utmost to ensure that we maintain public trust and faith in democracy, that we pursue accountability and transparency, and that we consult with as many different people and democratic structures as possible to make the best possible solution. And so with that, I would just like to thank, I see one of our speakers is no longer here, but I would like to thank the two who still are here. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of guidance, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I would also like to thank the Center for Human Rights, especially the Democracy Unit and the marketing team who provided technical support, and all those who helped make this webinar possible, without which we would not be able to be here discussing these very, very important ideas. And I'd also just like to thank everyone who has attended and has asked questions or simply listened, for their interest and for their engagement. Just a reminder that this is all being recorded, and so if you want to send it to a friend, want to just watch it at another time, you can do so. But also another important reminder that this is not the only webinar of this nature. The Center for Human Rights has been conducting quite a few and will continue to do so. There's one this Thursday, as well as on Tuesday at 11, including talks by a number of the center's own alumni, talks that might be a little more discursive in nature rather than panel discussions. So we invite you all to attend those. They're all now open to the public. Yeah, and I hope that we've all learned something and will continue to engage with the center to learn more. Thank you all once again, and goodbye.
Thank you.